lot to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and dive right in. So as Brian introduced me, hi, I'm Megan. Just to give you a little bit of background, so I've been building websites with WCAG and accessibility in mind for about 5 years now. So what I mean by accessibility, I know you've maybe heard this word used in a couple of different ways before. I'm not going to read this whole big blurb here. This is the W3C's definition for accessibility, but basically you just want to not create barriers for those with disabilities, with varying forms of disabilities too. They do go on to say things about socioeconomic relations on bandwidth and speed. I'm not covering performance or going quite into that part of it today, but you may have also heard accessibility meaning like it being accessible in other languages and all kinds of stuff, but I'm focusing more on making sure your interfaces work for those with disabilities today. But yeah, so I kind of got my start with accessibility stuff when I started this site about 5 years ago. And this is Craig Hospital. As you can kind of tell by the hero image here, they are a specialty hospital who happens to specialize in treating folks with spinal cord injuries and traumatic brain injuries. And while Craig Hospital does have some pretty amazing outcomes for many of their patients, of course, many of their patients have to live with the realities of what they have going forward. And so Craig also focuses on making sure people learn the right tools and learn how to use the right things so they continue to be productive and have healthy, fulfilling lives, even if they do have a disability. So when I got this project, I wasn't required to make the site accessible. It wasn't asked for by the client. It wasn't required legally. This hospital is a private hospital. It does not take government funding. There was no reason I had to make this accessible, but I wanted to. I wanted to make a site that Craig Hospital's patients could use. So this kind of got me started. I already knew accessibility was a thing, but it was something I hadn't really pursued and kind of made myself learn. So this was the project. This was when I decided I'm going to learn how to do this. And so how accessible is Craig? This is from 5 years ago. I did a really quick Lighthouse test and it got a 95. This really surprised me. Because I know all of the problems with this site because I was specifically trying to focus on mobile disabilities given Craig's clientele. There are definitely some spots here that are way wrong, so take this with a grain of salt. Lighthouse lies a little bit. It's really good if you have somebody who really knows what they're doing auditing, because a lot of these automatic testing tools are maybe not quite there yet. So just another example, this is using a different auditing tool. You can see all those red little blips everywhere. A lot of this stuff is like contrast errors, but at the same time, there's definitely some things to fix. So it's been 5 years since then, and I've done a lot of speaking on the subject. I've been an advocate at Viget and kind of taught my peers on how to build with a little bit more accessibility and everything else. But I am a developer. I know I'm speaking to a UX audience and everything, so pardon my dev speak a little bit, but I did want to do this talk because ultimately my job is at the end of the pipeline. I have to do what I can with the designs I've been given to make them accessible, performant, everything else. But a lot of this thinking would be much better at the beginning of the pipeline. So bring it all to you to think of these things early on so that we have an easier time later building in these things or even making the experiences even better than I could do on my own. So I'm going to cover a few different things today, a very brief intro to what WCAG is, why you should be designing for accessibility, a little bit on the philosophy of inclusive design, considerations for accessibility and specifically what you need to design around, and then also just a kind of a list of resources to leave you all with. So intro to WCAG. I don't have time to go fully into the spec today, but WCAG has versions 2.0, and there's actually a newer version of 2.1. This is expected to be a living spec that's going to be continue to be added onto. And if you're a little confused by what I'm talking about, that actually stands for WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. So these are just a set of rules that you should follow to build your websites with accessibility. So currently we're on 2.1. The government standard is still stuck at 2.0 because they're going to take forever. They're probably not going to update that number for a very long time, but the newest is 2.1. And then there are 3 levels. So there's A, AA, and AAA, and those are additive. So A is the lowest level. Any rules in A are also in AA, and that's a little bit higher up. And then any rules in both A and AA are also in AAA. So it's kind of an additive spec. A should kind of be your baseline for most any site. AA is the current government standard for government sites. So lots of rules in there. And then AAA is kind of this pie in the sky. You'll never be accepted to meet this. But for your users, some of these rules might apply and might be a good go-to. But for the most part, here at Viget, on all of our projects, we try and aim for A. Many clients do ask for AA, and we'll meet that, and then we kind of assess if there are any AAA feature rules that we might want to include. And the basic tenets of this spec are POUR, P-O-U-R. All website content should be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Perceivable, just somebody should be able to see it, read it, have it read to them, have it be just available to them in some fashion. Operable, it should work no matter what device they're using. Understandable, that has to do a little bit with some cognitive disability, so they should understand the interface that they're looking at and the content that's in it. And then robust is probably the one where it's, what does that mean? That basically means it should work on a number of devices. So if you're building responsively, you're doing a lot of this already. And a really good reference to go to for this is the W3C has this really good resource here, their quick ref guide. This one's really nice because you can kind of filter it out to just rules that apply to you. You can see the filters on the left side, or you can kind of limit that down to interaction design, or you can limit it to only 2.0 if you're doing a government site that doesn't need the 2.1, or you can filter to be A, AA, AAA. So you can kind of filter it down, and the language is a little bit more plain language than if you're going through the spec outright. So I kind of like to reference this. That's all I'm really going to cover on WCAG for now. I'm going to mention it a few times, but I don't really have time to dive into everything else. But if all this seems a little scary, I will also add that as you read through the rules, you'll see this kind of common caveat, where if your site, if your app has to do something, if it's somehow essential to the function of something, then sometimes the rules can be bent a little bit. So you probably shouldn't bend the rules too much, but I'm kind of throwing it out there to make this a little less scary. If you feel like you have to do something, if your app requires you to wave your phone 3 times, like you're not necessarily breaking the spec if that's absolutely required to what you have to do. Anyway, so why design for accessibility? So just to take a quick poll, since I do have a bunch of people in front of me, sorry folks online, who here regularly uses an assistive device and is okay with sharing that? Can anybody raise your hand? Okay, so we've got a few. I'm going to change how I ask that question, and I want to see how the hands change here. So for those online, we only have 2 hands. So who here wears glasses? Got a lot more hands there. So that is inarguably an assistive device. It's so common in our culture now, we don't really think of it as such anymore, but that is definitely an assistive device. Also, who took our lovely super slow elevator this evening? I think all of you kind of had to, so that's not really a fair question. And while the elevator wasn't really invented as an assistive device, we often think of it as one now. It's kind of essential, especially with laws and ADA rules. And then also, the queue uses a keyboard. This is a tech audience, so I'm sure everybody's going to raise their hand. So this one, I admit, I'm stretching a little bit, but its predecessor, the typewriter, actually has its history based in accessibility. So just to go on a little history lesson here, way back in Italy in the early 1800s, we had Pellegrino Turri. And Pellegrino happened to have a friend, a countess, who was going blind. And they didn't live particularly close to each other and liked to correspond via mail, of course. But then with her degrading vision, the countess did have a little trouble with that. So there is actually a fictional book based off of this story now, if you'd like to go read it. But this was for the Contessa here. I'm not even going to try and read that name, sorry. But yes, and he did manage to correspond with the countess. Now, we don't exactly know what his device looked like. Nobody made a drawing of it or anything, but it was probably something like this, pretty clunky and pretty large. But basically, it of course had keys and then would use carbon paper to kind of press the letters into the page. And here's one of those pages. Not very many survive, but you can see kind of what he was working with here. So that was just a quick sample set of the room where we got quite a few folks. So let's try a larger sample. You guys are UX people. I take it you love data. So let's look at a larger sample of the population. So according to World Bank, 1 billion people, or 15% of the global population, experience some form of disability. So that's based off of their numbers. The CDC reports that in the US that could be as many as 1 in 4, so 25%. And that's based off of a Department of Health and Services survey where people were asked if they had trouble completing certain tasks. It's a very simple survey. So that's pretty high. A different study came in a little lower than that at 13%, based off of an ACS survey. But that survey also says that the number is rising. And they kind of attribute that to our rise in elderly population as we continue to age as a population. So you can kind of see that over time it's gone up, not tremendously quickly, but it's still going up, and putting it at that like 13%. And then another interesting thing from here is that it shows how after 65 we have a very large jump in the number of folks who have a disability after 65. So that's in America. I also wanted to point out in Japan, of course, with their also declining birth rate, while they're also having people live much longer, their kind of problem with this is even further exacerbated. So they, in 2015, had 26.6% of the population of 65 and older. Now that's not the disabled statistic, but it just goes to show that like they're going to have a little bit more of an issue with that, and that's going to get worse over time as well. Another study cited that they might have like 1 in 3 people over 65 by 2030. So this is going to be a rising demand, especially as digital natives get older, to make sure that our digital experiences work even if somebody does have a disability. So what will that percentage be like for us just in 2030, which isn't all that far away? But even though all those numbers are pretty compelling on like just statistically why you should care about making your sites accessible, I also do want to throw out there that do these numbers even matter? Because you wouldn't deny somebody access to your home or to your store because they had a disability, so then why would you deny your service to them either? So why design for accessibility? My like Captain Obvious, like this is why you should do it answer is always like it's just the right thing to do. But I understand we're like adults with constraints and everything else, so you do have to think about the statistics and some other practical reasons. Also, it's the law-ish. So for government sites, this is like non-negotiable. There is a requirement if you work on government sites or government-funded sites, but it's a little bit funnier for those of us who work in the private sector. So I have to go on a little bit of a detour. We're in a bit of a funny legal spot right now, so I feel like I have to do this for just a minute. So just to do a quick history of accessibility in US law, in 1990 we did have the ADA passed, that's the Americans with Disabilities Act, that officially says that if you discriminate based off of disability, that is a bad thing. You cannot do that. That is a civil rights issue. So that was absolutely firmly planted in the ground in 1990. 1998 we had Section 508 added to the Rehabilitation Act, which says that digital experiences should also be accessible for government. Again, government, so not private. So that gets a little bit funny. Then in 2002, we had another law case versus Southwest. But the big question mark from kind of from 2002 on is, what is a place of public accommodation? There's this piece of text in the ADA that says that places have to be accessible if it's a place of public accommodation. And the legal question has been, does the web count? And different judges have landed in different ways on this. In that particular case, the judge sided with Southwest. This is a virtual concept. It's not a place, so it doesn't count, is basically what the judge ruled. But then in 2006, this lawsuit actually ended in 2009, we had the National Federation for the Blind versus Target Corporation. That lawsuit went the other way for the Federation for the Blind. Weirdly, because Target has physical locations, it's a little funny on that. And since then, we've kind of had a spattering of cases against other online entities, but they keep getting settled out of court, so no more case law has been kind of decided since then. But the government did decide to refresh 508 standards. So if you're familiar with 508, there is actually a new standard. I mentioned WCAG. That is the new standard. So WCAG 2.0 AA is now the new standard, which replaces the previous 508. But I have to mention, this date does say 2017, but this went into effect January 18th, 2017. So 2 days before the Trump administration did take over. So ever since that date, accessibility law has kind of been stalled a bit. The DOJ has deprioritized it. So we haven't seen a lot of movement there. We have seen a lot of case law. So as of 2018, the refresh that was published officially took effect 1 year later on January 18th, 2018. And with no kind of movement from the DOJ, there has been a lot of lawsuits going up against accessibility. Some law firms want an actual solid decision on this, so they're kind of pushing the envelope on this. We've seen this, we've talked to other agencies where we've seen a lot more lawsuits go up. Beyonce even is getting sued for accessibility. It's really kind of skyrocketed. And then the newest one, which is the one where I had to kind of go through this today, is right now there's a lawsuit, Domino's Pizza versus Robles. So Robles, Guillermo Robles was not able to buy a pizza online in 2016, and this lawsuit is ongoing. The 9th District Court has ruled in Robles' favor and said that Domino's has to make their site accessible, but Domino's has now decided that they are taking this case to the Supreme Court. So we're waiting to see if they'll even hear the case, what they'll decide on it, and everything else. So we're kind of in limbo at the moment. If they don't hear the case, then the District 9 ruling will stand. Or if they do take the case, they could go either way on it. What makes this a little bit funny is if Domino's was saying we don't have to accommodate blind people, of course that would be thrown out of hand. But they are arguing that their due process rights have been violated by not having a clear standard on this. So I don't know which way this is gonna go. We'll see. So instead of leaving on that kind of funny note, I'll come back and summarize on why you should design for accessibility. It's the right thing to do. There is the questionable legal part of that. Also, to add some more practical notes to that, it really doesn't cost much to add it to your process. I will add a bit of an asterisk to that, where it doesn't cost much if you build it right from the start, and if you're building a typical web experience. If you're doing a crazy JavaScript web app, you're probably going to have to do more work to make it accessible. And also, I cannot say this enough, I could probably do a whole talk on it. Good accessibility does not mean bad design. I think there was kind of a bad association there with government sites looking a little old. It's oh, that's accessibility. No, you can make something beautiful and still be accessible. Sorry if I seem to be hitting on the government. I don't mean to. But yes, and also the last note I'll leave on is accessibility features really help everyone. So if you look in the real world, there's a lot of examples of this. A ramp isn't just good for somebody in a wheelchair, it's great for somebody with bad knees or little kids that have trouble with steps and everything else. These things help a lot of people. Going another step further where you see closed captions in a lot of life. Yes, sorry, I picked a funny one. For closed captions, they help a lot of people too. It's not just for the deaf. If you're in a loud environment, or if you're watching Game of Thrones and you don't want your 4-year-old a couple seats over to hear the screams and everything. Captions end up helping a lot of people if you don't want to wake somebody up or whatever else, or have a video on at work. For educational purposes. Yes, but I'll also say that, so one thing I'm going to touch on a little bit today is having good keyboard accessibility in your web interfaces. So that doesn't just help people with mobility issues, it also helps your power users, your people who prefer not to have their hands leave the keyboard and all those keyboard shortcuts and everything else. You're also helping them. And then we have all these trendy speech interfaces now, which are great for us. I love being lazy and not leaving the sofa to ask what time it is. But it does help a lot of people who can kind of automate their lives and make their lives easier. And then I would be remiss if I didn't mention the iPhone, because this was kind of such a large societal change for everyone to begin with. So many things became easier for so many people, and the accessibility community was certainly highly aided by this, particularly the blind community. Having a camera, microphone, touch screen, little computer in your pocket really opens a lot of doors and opens the doors for a lot of apps to be developed that help people in certain niches. So moving on from that topic, I think I gave enough reasons. I did want to talk now about inclusive design and kind of the landscape of ability you need to design for. So Microsoft has some really good documentation on this. I really like their kind of approach to this. You can go to their site, microsoft.com/design/inclusive. They have their philosophy on inclusive design. And I particularly like how they treat this, where you don't just have the most severe form of a disability. They really treat accessibility as serving humans in all of their forms and states and everything else, because disabilities aren't just permanent disabilities. They're also if you temporarily break your arm, or if you just happen to not be able to use a particular sense or limb at the moment. So that these disabilities can be permanent, temporary, or situational. And they have these kind of three steps or tenets in their particular inclusive design. Recognizing exclusion, learn from diversity, and solve for one and extend to many. So their whole process is find, learn, extend. And I really like that philosophy. And just to kind of go over that last one a little bit more, and to quote another famous designer, so Dan Formosa from Smart Design says, "We have clients come to us and say, here's our average customer, for instance. Female, she's 30 to 40 years old, she has 2.3 kids, and we listen politely and we say, well, that's great, but we don't care about that person. What we really need to do to design is to look at the extremes, the weakest, or the person with arthritis, or the athlete, or the strongest, or the fastest person. Because if we understand what the extremes are, the middle will take care of itself." Now, I will take issue with his approach a little bit. Like, I think designing for extremes is a really good starting point, especially when you're talking about disabilities. There's so much variety and preference and so many in-betweens. I think you can't go only for the extremes. There are some experiences that you have to specifically design for that are in the middle, but it's a good place to start. And then coming back to Microsoft, they also have this bit where designing inclusively does not mean you're making one thing for all people. You're designing a diversity of ways for everyone to participate in an experience with a sense of belonging. So I kind of agree with this because in my experience, inclusive design often means to give options or to surrender control over your interface so that the person can adapt to their own best method of using it. So to give you a little bit more context on that, so give options, what I mean by that is, like right now, dark modes are super trendy, right? But they're kind of unintentionally an accessibility aid. Sometimes the dark version, it has better contrast and is easier to read than the light version. Also, there's certain niches like folks with migraines where that darker screen might prevent them from having a migraine that particular day and kind of is a little easier on their eyes. And then by surrender control, this is probably the scary one. You're like, what do I have to do? What are you suggesting here? But in a way, you guys have already done this. Responsive design is kind of a way of surrendering control. You can't control the width of your screen. You've already given up that level of control on that, and you've adapted to it, right? So like we adapted to responsive design, I think you can adapt to inclusive design. It's just a matter of designing for more states and designing for more ways that people can access your interface. So one example, I don't know if people know this exists, but if you go into your Chrome settings, this is a screenshot from Chrome, sorry, people use other browsers, but I'm sure people know about page zoom, but Chrome now has this feature where you can bump up your text size. By default, it's set to medium for everybody, but you can set it to large. So just to show the New York Times an example of how that changes, this is it with a normal size, and then you can just bump up the size. It doesn't change any breakpoints, it doesn't change your layout or hit any media queries, it just makes the text bigger. And it's great if you can make your interface respond like that. Your developer has to build it right for it to do that, but it's great if you can have that work for folks, because they don't always want to change the layout, they just want the text bigger. Mm-hmm. Another example of surrendering control that's a little bit different is giving control back to your users. So this is a site we built for Shed Aquarium, and this is just a still image, but that background image is actually video on their live site. And we have given back control by kind of adding this pause button. So somebody can stop that if they want that background video to stop. So that's another option, another kind of example of giving an option and also surrendering control for them to change the interface. So considerations for accessibility. Before I start on this, I'm gonna get a drink. Okay. So what are the kind of barriers that people usually hit? What are the things that we need to design around? What are the disabilities that we need to account for? So again, I do throw in here Microsoft's documentation. They're a great resource. I also really like this site, even though it's old, the Alphabet of Accessibility Issues. So these are almost like 26 personas, A through Z. It goes through and it gives a very brief description of an issue that somebody might have or a disability they may have and a little bit about that person. And then for more long form reading, I really recommend this book, A Web for Everyone. So it was written by a designer and a UXer, and this has 8 really great personas in it of people who have particular disabilities. And I really love how fleshed out they are. Like there's one man in it who's a young man who's very fit and active and loves his iPhone, but he's blind. So, and that's just kind of a minor part of his character. So I really recommend that book. So types of disability, I am going to go into more depth on what you need to do to account for these, but just to do a quick list. We have speech disabilities, so somebody could be nonverbal, has a stutter or stammer. I am including ESL in this because I feel like a lot of the accessibility rules that help those folks end up helping people with where English is their second language. That can go into like cognitive too. So somebody who is like, just to be clear, like somebody who does not have a disability but might have a language barrier or something like that. For hearing, somebody could be hard of hearing or deaf. For vestibular disorders, which you may not be familiar with, it's somebody who could have vertigo, spatial disorientation, or just is easily affected by motion. Cognitive, so memory, attention, or developmental issues. Motor issues, so they might have limited use of motor control in their hands, tremors, or just a slow reaction time. And then vision, so color blindness, low vision, and blindness. And just to throw this in here, one of the studies that I do cite does have some statistics on these, at least on a few of them. Cognitive is actually almost as high as 5%. I'll touch on that a little bit. So, and just to also caveat, like I'm generalizing a little bit, like if you get into the accessibility community, everybody's has different preferences. They might have compounding issues where they might have a few of these together. They might have, I don't know. It's just very different, but I am generalizing a little bit for the sake of giving you guys some very clear information. So speech. Generally, we don't hit this one too much because when I say speech, I'm talking about the disability. We're not talking about like speech interfaces where something is talking back at them, but rather something somebody might talk to. On the web, we don't do that too much, so I'm not covering that too much, but it's not something you should rely on. Like speech recognition is actually something we kind of joke about a lot. I don't know if people have seen this skit where it's two men from Scotland get into a lift and the only control is a voice control at the top and it doesn't recognize what they're saying. So here's a very good example of why you should not rely on kind of speech inputs in kind of a funny way. So hearing. So this is also another one that we don't deal with too much, except with video. And of course sometimes people have to do audio embeds as well. But typically, like we try to avoid the restaurant site that's like blaring sound, right? By the way, make people able to stop that if you have to design that. But I'm just going to talk about video for now. And anyway, so if you're adding videos to your sites, they should really have captions. That is a rule by WCAG standards. All videos should have captions. I know that's a bit of a high ask from clients. We've had some issues with that, but you should provide captions, a transcript, or both. One thing that we've been doing, especially because captions are such a high ask, is we've been trying to add areas where our clients can kind of paste in the transcript for their videos. So we'll kind of put this read transcript button, clicking on that would then open a well that would then have the content in there. So somebody has the transcript available, but it's kind of tucked away a little bit. And that's a little bit of an easier ask than captions. Captions, you either have to like dive into YouTube and how they handle captions, or you have to produce a particular type of file to be included with the video, and it's a little bit harder. But if you can do captions, people really like captions. I was kind of surprised by this statistic. 85% of Facebook video is watched without sound. So people definitely like their captions, regardless of ability. So if you can add them, please do. So vestibular disorders. Again, this is the one that you guys may not be as familiar with, but you may know a pop culture reference to someone with this disorder. So if anybody's familiar with Arrested Development and Lucille too, of course the show kind of makes a gag out of it, but she does have a particular disorder. She has vertigo, which is a vestibular disorder. So if you ever need a persona, like just throw her in there. You can use her as your example of somebody with a vestibular disorder who might want to use your website. But anyway, so I am going to give you a couple examples of sites that would affect somebody with a vestibular disorder. Usually it's if you're doing kind of overlapping motion in certain effects. So if you have any type of disorder, you may want to look away now. So basically this is just like a parallax effect on this particular fashion site where the combination of the angles and the way that things kind of move at different rates, particularly the very end of the GIF, there's like one like desk graphic that stays still while the rest of the interface keeps moving. I don't know if anybody else is feeling ill from this. This kind of set me off a little bit. I don't even have any known anything. But yes, so something like this can easily set somebody off, so maybe avoid this or provide an out. Another example, and this one doesn't animate, so it's safe now. But this one doesn't, I just have screenshots of the animation. So this one was, Nick Jones has this particular portfolio site. He likes experimental interfaces and like, you go, you do your thing. But he does this very interesting effect where as you scroll, the whole site spins.
Whoa.
Which is really cool, and it's and like with the scrolling, you can kind of control the rate of how it moves and everything. But it's gonna set some people off. So my advice on this one is you can do it, but provide an out. Like let somebody say, I don't want this, turn it off, and make sure that that's readily accessible right away. Nick Jones actually did a great job. He got some feedback on this and added this little warning. So that says, do not proceed if you suffer from vertigo or find experimental interfaces offensive. And you can click for a more accessible version. His more accessible version is just a normal scrolling stacked site. And then you should also provide an out. I've mentioned that background video from before. Adding that pause button is exactly the same kind of thing. You give that out, and this is required by WCAG. For some extra reading, I do really recommend this particular article, Designing Safer Web Animation for Motion Sensitivity by Val Head. So even if somebody has one of these disorders, some animations might set them off, but not all of them. And a lot of people still like animation, even if some particular effects are problematic for them. So I recommend reading this article and kind of figuring out where that line is and what you can do and what you can't, and try not to affect somebody in that way. Okay, so cognitive. So this one's a little harder to talk about, but let's chat about it just a little. So earlier I described that as memory, attention, and developmental issues. Now I'm not going to dive into this too much. There's a whole realm of like brain science and user experience and interfaces and everything that you can go into to kind of create these interfaces that can be hugely impactful for this community. Whether it's an autistic nonverbal kid being able to like use graphics and things like that to communicate. There's a huge like need and awesome community for these kinds of things. I love to see this kind of stuff, but today I'm talking about web. I'm not as well versed in that particular area, so I'm just going to give some basic tenets here. So be clear, be concise, be consistent, and avoid being distracting. So there are some rules in WCAG that are usually in the highest AAA level that deal with cognitive disability, where you should write to a 6th grade level and kind of be as clear and concise as you can and try and be brief. But for most sites, you're not going to hit AAA. You might want to make sure you do that for if you have a particular user set. Government sites are also great because they have to serve everybody, so government, you should be following this. But I do want to focus on also that be distracting bit a little bit. So 11% of children have been diagnosed with ADHD in 2011. So this is a large statistic. It's only 4% in adults, but there's probably some disparity there just from not reporting or whatever else, but that's a lot of people. That's a lot of people that are using your interface that are probably going to be easily distracted. And you can kind of follow the same rules as we did in the vestibular order section. If there's something distracting, if there's some kind of animation, you can do it, but provide an out. If you have an automatic video or anything like that, like that's going to pull somebody's attention away from the content that they need to be reading right now. So yes, provide your out. If you did want to read into the, or dig into the readability and making sure you're writing to a 6th grade level and all of that, there are tools for that. I'm just throwing one out there for now, readable.com. So basically you can throw some text in this and it'll give you a rating of how readable your text is. I just threw in a paragraph from the New York Times, so maybe not 6th grade level, which is why it's giving me that E. So motor. I left motor and vision for last because those are the ones we typically have to accommodate for the most. So going back to Craig Hospital, we have some examples of that, of people who have are definitely on the further end of the spectrum with this disability, and they use a lot of assistive devices. Oh right, and also another resource that I can throw out there that can kind of help you get an idea of why you need to account for motor disabilities is this Funkify plugin. So this is something you can add to Chrome, and you can choose kind of a disability to simulate while you're using a website. I'll kind of show what that looks like in a little bit. But this can kind of help you simulate what that experience might be like. Oh, I'm gonna do that now. I forgot that I reordered something. Okay. So it's just to show you guys what Funkify does and why you need to accommodate for motor disabilities. So I'm gonna pull up Craig Hospital, so I conveniently have that handy, and I'm gonna turn on Funkify. And it has a number of kind of personas listed here that you can simulate. Since I'm talking about motor disabilities at the moment, I am going to use Trembling Trevor. So this is why you need to account for motor disabilities, because with somebody who has Parkinson's, this might be their experience where using a mouse is just going to be very difficult. So for those who maybe not be able to see on my screen, what the Funkify tool is doing is it's taking my mouse and having it just kind of shake and move around a lot, which makes it very hard to focus on and click links that are on the screen, like this little bit of text that's not very tall, that blue link there. So somebody who has like a Parkinson's or a disability like that, their best bet is either going to be an assistive device or something like that, or just their keyboard. So to kind of jump back in here, and I'll show another couple of those things in Funkify in a minute. But people might use assistive devices if they have trouble with their wrists. They might just use like a funky mouse. As you get further into the disability spectrum, you have things like this. You have a sip and puff device, large click switches, head wands. Then you get into the very high tech, more like eye tracking or motion detection with these particular glasses. They just kind of detect how much you move your head, and then you can click by biting the blue mouthpiece. So these probably look really scary. Like, how am I going to test for this? How do I add this to my device lab and everything? But ultimately, all of those things just simulate the things your computer does already. It simulates clicks, it simulates keyboards, inputs. So the real thing that you have to have in your device lab is just a keyboard, as long as you're testing and making sure you can use your site with just a keyboard and no mouse. So if you haven't done that before, I'm not going to go through that in depth, but basically hit tab a few times the next time you're trying to use a website. Just hit tab or shift tab to go backwards and see what links pop up and if you're able to do things. And also, everybody notice the nice blue ring that you get on everything? People love to take that out, but do not remove the outline, or at least be very careful when and where you do. But don't remove that. That's there for a reason. That's there for keyboard accessibility. If you didn't know that before, you know that now. And just to give an example, like if you're using a site with only a keyboard, like that's how you tell if something is selected on the screen. So you can kind of tell between these two slides. That button definitely gets selected. We have a nice big focus state, and that blue outline is kind of big, just barely there. So this is kind of an old version of Craig Hospital. It's been updated a little bit since then, but this will play through pretty quickly. You can kind of see me using a keyboard while accessing that site. So it's done already. Don't lose 3 months. But you could kind of see where I was through the page through that very quick animation. So with keyboard accessibility, the big thing there is just make sure it works. This is kind of the easiest thing that you can do. Like as a developer, it was the easiest type of accessibility to learn how to build for because I already have a keyboard. I use it all the time, and you just have to make sure everything works. But I trust you guys can help me make it work better. So let me give you a couple more examples of that. An example of a good example and a bad example. So I'm going to start with the good example. So you guys saw in my Craig Hospital example, you could always kind of tell where you were on the page. Now Amazon's still not great. It can still be a little hard to see where that blue focus ring is, but you can kind of tell where you are. It's there. So you can see I'm in like that right sidebar now. And they've specifically ordered the page so that I get to that sidebar and can order stuff faster. Like that's first for a reason in my tab order. But you can tell where you are, right? If you come back to the search, you can get the stuff. It all works. Now to show you a different example. Sorry, ModCloth, I do like you, but not in this context. I'm gonna hit tab a few times and can you tell where I am at all?
Yep.
I am going through lots of links, but I can't tell where I am either. So that's kind of that importance of that blue outline. So going back. So vision. So that's the big thing of motor is you just have to make sure that you can use all of the functionality on your site with just a keyboard. With vision, there's a lot to consider here. You guys do a lot of visual designs and things like that. There's a lot more that's on your plate here than mine, or a lot more than there was in the other categories. So again, we're accounting for no vision, low vision, and colorblind. So with no vision, that's actually a lot of that work is on your developer to do to make sure that somebody with no vision who's using a site with only a screen reader gets all of the information that they need. Your code has to be well formatted and everything else so that people can jump to all of the pieces of the page that they need to. But there are some places where you guys can kind of help us out with that, which I think you might even find really interesting. So I'm going to play you a video of, we recently had this challenge on Shed Aquarium of making their checkout flow much more accessible. And particularly this one area where as you change your quantity of tickets, how do we announce to the user, how do we tell the user that their quantity has changed and then also the amount in their cart, their actual total price has changed. This is gonna play for me, right? Come on, this was loaded.
The Wi-Fi details are up here.
I work here. Okay, I don't think that's gonna work out, but instead what I can do, so sorry I'm winging this here a little bit, I am gonna turn on a little bit of our accessibility tool and have it read out. Enable voiceover. So I'm not sure what the sound is gonna come out of though. But you guys can see it will kind of show you exactly what's being read. So as I hit tab, remember how to do this. There we go. Now I'm like trapped in something. Okay, maybe this wasn't a good idea, but at least I tried. Okay, that video is not going to work out. But basically, the challenge that we hit was kind of making that announcement. So what we ended up doing was each of those buttons says exactly what it's going to do. It's going to say change quantity to 1, change quantity to 2, and increase quantity to 1, increase quantity to 2. And that'll keep incrementing as you add on, and then as you add tickets, it also announces like your new total is $79.98. So this is kind of stuff we do at the end. Like, these are developers making these UX decisions on what does a speech interface look like. And I would love to pull you guys into that process so that you're also deciding what that experience is like, and it's not just an afterthought at the end. Okay. So low vision, we have a lot more rules here and a lot of things to keep in mind. So keep color contrast and be flexible. So flexible goes back to that rule of like, be ready to let go of some control, because people are going to look at your site a little bit differently. They might change the font size, like in our earlier example, or they might use a screen magnifier. So that will scroll left to right for as far as they need it to. Some people need things to be this size in order to read them. And then color contrast. Color contrast I think is really important, even if you're not building for accessibility, just building for somebody using your app outside. Color contrast can really affect somebody's experience. So WCAG has some very specific rules for this of measuring color contrast. Text should be a 4.5:1 contrast with the background. You can get a little looser with that if you have big text over a certain size. With buttons and things like that, they should also follow the text contrast of 4.5:1, but then buttons should also have a 3:1 contrast with their background color because they're interactive. Interactive things need to stand out from the background also. So there's all kinds of rules like that built into WCAG. So how do you check color contrast? There's a lot of sites out there that you can use. You can just plug in the two colors you're using and see if they pass or not. And you can see AA, AAA, like all that stuff on the bottom. It'll tell you if it passes or not. So that's colorcontrastchecker.com, or rather contrastchecker.com. ColorSafe is also kind of a cool one that lets you kind of build a palette. And also, if anybody uses Sketch or Figma, Stark I think is also a bit of an independent product, but they do have plugins for both Sketch and now Figma. There's just recently a Figma version. So you can kind of just add these to your designs and have it check for you. Also, order and element placement do matter. I'm not going to go into this with too much detail, but because some people read your site like this with a screen magnifier, it matters where you put things. So if you put your error message all the way to the left, how's somebody going to find that if they're looking at the screen like that? They're probably going to be scrolling up and down to see like, okay, they need my name, they need my address, they need all of this. They're not going to, like, if you put something way off where they wouldn't expect it to be, this is such a limited view, they're not going to find it. And so keep that in mind. I'm not going to go too much further into that. But I am going to show you another Funkify example that's relevant to this. So not exactly screen magnification, but another kind of vision disorder is if somebody has tunnel vision. So they might experience your site like this. They're able to see just this kind of tunnel of content at the time. So you can see, I can kind of scan the page looking at the side and everything. And it might be a little harder to notice things that are over on the right. So these are great tools to check and like think about while you're designing your interface. And the last one that I haven't touched on yet is colorblind. So don't rely only on color in your designs to convey information. Color should be for branding and brightness and attention, but for information, you can't rely on only color. So just to give an example of that, here is a form. Yay, forms. You can see we have like a kind of success state and an error state. And once I take the color out of that, so this is simulating DETOUR, NoVA, I can't say these words. You can see once I take the color away, once I simulate a certain kind of color deficiency, you can't really tell the difference between those colors. So how do you tell what is an error and what is a success? This technically passes because it does have an error message. Like, that is the difference between the two things. That is enough to pass accessibility rules that, hey, this is an error here. There's something there that is not just color, so that passes. But is that the best experience? What we've kind of been doing lately is adding icons as well, just some other visual indicator to say this is right, this is wrong, that isn't just color. And another example where you might have something like this, Nike has actually fixed this. So this is an old version of their site where you see that where they have that color filter on the left. So the issue with this, of course, is then people who happen to be colorblind are not going to be able to use that particular filter. And I mean, people will use this. You can't just say like they're colorblind, they're not going to use it. Like that people have to buy for other folks, or one of our own developers who happens to be colorblind always wears red hats. Like that's his choice. His accent color is red. So if you want him to be able to find his red hat, he needs to be able to use this filter. But luckily they've updated this, and it's just a very simple change. They've just added the names of the colors underneath, and it's a lot easier. So another tool that I use that I'm throwing out there is Color Oracle. So this is actually a system level tool, not a browser level tool, where you can kind of just turn on and kind of simulate certain modes of color blindness. I will show that really quick. So here I have this here, and I can simulate each of these color blindness. Let me go to something with a little bit more color. It does turn off the second you like do something else. So you can see this screen change. All those oranges are just kind of washed out. And then of course just complete grayscale. Keep in mind this tool, if you do, like I said, if you do anything on your screen after you've activated it, it turns back off. So good for just really quick checks. Okay, and then also one last couple things on colorblind friendliness. You can pick colorblind friendly color palettes. Here's an article from Tableau on doing good colorblind friendly visualizations. So there are color palettes that you can do, or you can rely more on tone than color in order to convey, if you need to do a data visualization or something where you need to use color to convey information. And then also provide alternatives. I always like to throw out this example that Trello does. They have a colorblind friendly mode where it just kind of adds a pattern to all those colorful labels, so they still get a quick view of like, oh, that's green, that label belongs to this category. So they still get the same quick reference experience, it's just a little bit different. And I'm usually not a big fan of accessibility modes. I think you should focus on like, this is the feature I'm enhancing. Like colorblind friendly modes I'm happy with, or if you want to do a high contrast mode, or if you want to do something like that, don't do an accessibility mode. Like you're just lumping too many people into one category and it's confusing, and just don't do that. But these I'm cool with. But pretty much anything, when in doubt, provide a text alternative. Text can be experienced in so many ways. It can be read with your eyes, it can be read to you, it can be translated to Braille, etc., etc. When in doubt, provide text. So images, our clients are always terrible about putting in alt text. I'll sometimes force them to put in a caption for any kind of graphics or something like that. If you can't make the graphic as accessible as you'd like it to be, at least make sure that you're providing a caption that gives the gist of the data and everything. So do what you can, and when in doubt, throw in some text. Okay, so that's pretty much all I have today. My resources and tools section is kind of just a refresh of the things I've mentioned already. There's of course the WCAG quick reference guide, Funkify, which I think is a great tool just for you to like know what's out there and how people are experiencing your sites. Lighthouse as one like really quick auditing tool. It's flawed, but it can be a really good quick check. This particular screenshot, I was using Accessibility Insights for web. They have a Chrome extension that's great. I really like using their tool. They have a fast pass check, and then also you can go really into the weeds where you're checking off every spec in WCAG, saying I did that or I didn't. Another one that's been around for longer that I'll still use on occasion is the Wave webbing tool. That also has a Chrome extension where it'll do something that looks like this. And the other tool, Accessibility Insights, does something similar, but it will also do that where it'll kind of like on top of your page note your errors. I have not used this service, but I have seen another UXer mention it. Loop 11, if you want to do user testing, they can accommodate accessibility testing as well if you want somebody with a particular disability to try your site. And then of course going back to Microsoft's inclusive design, the alphabet of accessibility issues, a web for everyone, readable.com, and all those contrast checkers. Okay, so the note I want to leave you all with is, so something that I did here at Viget is, like, I didn't just build Craig Hospital, I also brought that knowledge back to my team, and then that became an initiative, and that became something that our whole team really latched onto and became passionate about. So it's not just me, everybody at Viget. It's been so inspiring to, like, not always be the one annoying everybody else about accessibility things. They come to me with questions, or they teach me things and everything else. So I think it's great to, even if you're just starting, be an advocate and trying to get everybody else on your side. And I can't cover everything in one night. Like, hopefully I've given you all enough resources to get started and know how to test and know how to find what's wrong and how to accommodate it. And so hopefully I've inspired you a little bit to know just enough to kind of get yourself going. So be curious, be eager, share progress. I'm always learning new stuff. Screen reader technology right now is like the Wild West of browsers, where one thing works here and another thing doesn't work there. So I always love knowledge sharing there, so knowing what to look out for. And I really don't think you have to be an expert to get started. I still don't really consider myself an expert because my full-time job is front-end developer, and I happen to like try and read up on this accessibility stuff a lot. So you don't have to be an expert to get started or to be the expert on your team. So hopefully that has been helpful. Thank you all. I think we have time for questions and stuff. And yes, thanks.
Yes. So, is it me?
Yes.
Okay. So our product has some sort of animation interaction with the users. So I think for color contrast, we already have some tool to test the usability, if it pass WCAG or not.
Yeah.
But is there any tool we can test if the animation will be user-friendly enough for the people who is vertical or some sort of motion sickness?
So the question, especially for the folks maybe watching at home, was if there's any way to test if animations are problematic for people with vestibular disorders. I am not aware of a test. And in fact, WCAG doesn't really have a spec for like animations in particular, so I'm afraid I don't have an answer for you there. Generally, I try and avoid large animations that go across the whole screen or really blow up really big. I might combine a little bit of motion with a fade in, so you still get the feeling of like moving up or left or right or whatever, but it's a fade in, it's not as large. So you mostly want to avoid large kind of overlapping animations.
Got it.
So, but I don't know of a testing tool, sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Question back there?
What was the voice over or voice simulation tool you were showing, the one that you couldn't?
Oh yeah, that I couldn't get working, sorry. So I was using, so on all Mac computers, on all Mac devices even, so even on your phone, anything Mac comes with VoiceOver installed. I actually really, part of why I'm a little clunky with it on desktop is I actually really like to test on my phone. The touch interface makes it really easy for me to kind of do some voice testing on my phone. So that's VoiceOver. If you're testing with something else on, generally with VoiceOver you want to test with Safari. They're kind of, with screen readers you kind of want to do a pairing of like which one works best with it when you do testing. So if you're using VoiceOver, it's best to test it with Safari. If you're using on Windows, JAWS, I think usually you want to do Internet Explorer. NVDA is also on Windows is good with Firefox, I think. And then Android does have its own version that I can't remember what it's called right now. But yes. Oh, and if you have like a Chromebook book or something like this, there is also a Chrome version that's like built in right now. That one's a little iffy because it's not used as much as the other ones. Like, you should really test with another screen reader on top of that one right now. I think it's Chromebox. Okay. Hopefully that answers your question. Yes.
Me?
Yes.
Do you, given the kind of one of the ethos of Viget, if I pronounced that right?
Yeah.
Do you get to do any usability testing with people that have some of these impairments?
So the question was if we get to do any usability testing with folks with disabilities and impairments. Fortunately, no. We have contacted a particular contractor, so we have somebody like ready to go if we want to do that level of testing. We did even have some early conversations with Craig Hospital on whether they'd want some of their folks to test the site. That never worked out. But we've got somebody like ready to go to like do the testing. We just haven't had quite the right client, quite the right budget. Most of our testing we're doing ourselves, and we're a Mac shop, so that's usually a lot of voiceover.
Yeah, UX crowd, you're always gonna get that question.
I know, yeah, of course.
Unless you have a blind user in your organization. I used to work at the USPTO and there was
Yeah.
a blind user. So whenever we wanted to test things, we would go to him.
Hmm.
And he would turn on his monitor just for us because he never had his monitor on.
Yeah.
It was really fascinating and scary because how does he use it, you know?
Yeah.
So you see how he uses it and then a lot of our things would pass and some of them would fail and we would see it in action and it was fascinating
Hmm.
to see, you know, again, he would zoom in like she showed, it would tab over and JAWS would read so fast. You have, I mean, these screen readers are so fast, it's so difficult to
Well,
follow.
that's usually a personal setting.
Personal
like
setting.
So somebody was
Yeah.
just retelling a story of a tester of theirs. And yeah, it's interesting if you see anybody who uses a screen reader full time, they crank the speed up
So
so fast you can't even tell what's going on. But that's only over the stuff that they read all the time.
Yeah.
So navigation items,
Navigation.
jumping between buttons. If somebody were to like use a screen reader to read out like the content of the page, they'd slow it down.
Slow it down.
But just getting through navigation items, and I totally get it because once you start testing with this stuff, you hear a lot of repetition, like button, link, click here. Like it's a lot of stuff, and a lot of the repetition you can't necessarily avoid. Like I mentioned, like screen readers are the Wild West right now. Some support some things, some support others. So sometimes you have to be repetitive to make sure everybody's covered. Like this is gonna say required twice. But I don't know if there's going to be a screen reader somewhere that's not going to support ARIA required. So it's just going to say it twice. So,
It's okay.
yeah.
Could have done it twice.
I hate that it's like that, but I'd rather make sure everybody's covered. Yes.
So with accelerated mobile pages, that's like a lightweight technology to get page down into your feed and that sort of thing. And they usually give you an option at the bottom to sort of view the real page, or the page that's fully featured. Would it be equally reasonable to have a page be accessible by default, and instead of an opt-out situation, an opt-in situation to a fuller experience?
Okay, so the question was whether it would be a good idea or preferable to start out with a more like bare bones page and then opt into a perhaps less accessible but more full featured experience. And I'm gonna say that's not a good idea because I mean everybody has different preferences and everything else. There's gonna be parts of that full featured experience that they like, even if some parts don't work for them, and then you're still being somewhat discriminatory by not giving them the full featured site. So I think it's really best to have one version of your site, try to make it as accessible as you can. Like even the best sites are gonna maybe have a couple of dings. But you should really try to make it accessible so that you're including everyone. And then any extra modes or anything on top of that, like high contrast and things like that, should be like thought about with very thoroughly before you think about adding them. There have been other sites that have taken that route where it's like, go to the accessibility version of the site, and it's, I just don't agree with those in general.
Can I ask a second?
Yeah.
So this is more of a developer-y question. So
Yeah.
are there testing tools available that can function within the context of like the continuous integration pipeline?
Oh, absolutely. So the question was if there are continuous integration options. So there's absolutely those. Alley, there's a million of them that you can kind of add on to do automatic testing. If you're using React, they have React Alley. Whenever I say Alley, it's A11Y, by the way, which is kind of a shorthand for accessibility. A, 11 letters, Y. So that's what accessibility comes from. So there's a million and one frameworks for testing for that. I would also, if you're writing your own tests, you can also pretty easily write tests around like, are these HTML attributes here when they should be? Because a lot of accessibility is, do you have good HTML? Are the attributes what they should be? Do they convey the state of the component and things like that? So there's definitely a lot of options. I can't list all of them and give URLs off the top of my head.
There's a
Yeah.
there's a company called DQ Labs.
Yeah.
DQ
Mhm.
DEQUE whatever, and they have the engine that drives a lot of their commercial
Yeah.
products is open sourced,
Yes.
and it's very easy to slot into build pipelines or like run in a developer environment. So AXE, kind of hard to Google that, but
Yeah.
maybe with some spelling with DQ might get a dig.
Yeah, so he just mentioned DQ and their kind of Axe testing tools, which are used a lot. There is one specifically for React also. We're a bit of a React shop, so those I'm a little more familiar with that stuff. So DQ Axe. I think there's also Tenon.io. I think has a similar service. I'm kind of pulling that off the top of my head though. But yeah. Question in the back.
Yeah, I don't have a question, but I have compliments. I would like to thank your team who helped you put it together, and obviously you did a great job presenting. And I like the accessibility part of your presentation, where you are repeating the questions that are asked, because a lot of people are sitting in the back. So you're doing that, and that's
Thank you. So you had a question up front?
Yes, I have a kind of a specific question. So we have a feature in our app, and it's a weather widget, and you can basically switch between Fahrenheit into Celsius.
Mm-hmm.
And we do build our app with accessibility in mind. But I had a question. So if you click on that Celsius to turn to Celsius, the focus kind of stays on it, and
Mhm.
it just stays selected. Is
Yeah.
there a specific time that it's required to stay on it, or should it just stay forever? Is there a way to kind of like, I don't know, decrease, fade it out?
So the question was, so I mentioned not taking off the blue focus ring earlier,
Yeah.
and her question was specifically like they have a set of tabs, and if you click on one of the tabs, it stays focused on
Yes.
forever, and everybody's annoyed by this. So if yours is a native app, I don't necessarily have an answer for you, but
It's not.
okay, so it is a web app. So one thing that we use, which may be controversial to some accessibility folks, but one thing that we use is a tool called What Input. And it's just a tiny little JavaScript library, and it just tells you whether somebody's using a touch screen, a keyboard, or a mouse.
Okay.
And we kind of use that to selectively remove the focus ring when somebody's using a mouse or perhaps a touch screen. So if somebody is using a keyboard or switches to using their keyboard from their mouse, they would absolutely get the focus
Okay.
ring. And that's been used by that's been pulled into some other tools and everything. So I think a good part of the community is okay with that technique.
Okay.
What's the name of that again?
What input?
Oh, what input, not web input.
Yeah, what input?
Alright. Thank you.
You're welcome. And of course, since that's JavaScript, that's kind of a progressive enhancement thing. The focus ring we try and make sure we only remove it when JavaScript is on and that is running. Yes.
So I have a question. I'm dealing with a little issue. I do UX, but I'm also from a 508 background. And today I saw something that another designer had done, and it said there was a button to start an option that says start here. And that jumped to me. I'm like, you never use the word here in accessibility.
Yeah.
You know, and because for me it was rather than start here, it says start application, start project, whatever. And I know this is mainly for accessibility issue because in the background you will say start here, but there's no context, right?
Correct.
So how do you, I mean, that's one of the best practices, I think,
Yeah.
to not put the word here, click here, start here. It makes no sense, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So the kind of question here was just kind of talking about some best practices for buttons. So if someone's using a screen reader, they can jump around and read all of the links on your site out of context, which is why this is generally a good rule. She mentioned a start here button. If you hear that completely out of context, you don't know what that does. Read more buttons are like the big example of like, don't do this. Because especially if you have a big list of stuff and it's like read more, read more, read more. If somebody using a screen reader is scanning the links on a page, they're going to hear 10 read mores, and those all go to different things, and they don't know what it is. So there's a couple ways you can handle that. One is like making good copywriting decisions early on. Another option, and this is on the development side, so this is something I would do for you. Hopefully you would tell me to do this. But one thing that we'll do is we can build in some invisible text, additional text into that button. So visually you would read start here, but we can put in some invisible text that says start here to start the application. Same with read more links. Read more about name of article here. So that's kind of a dev trick that we'll do. I think that's everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.